in the big scheme of things, this is a $500 billion, 30-year investment in a nuclear program pretty much demolished. That's an enormous accomplishment.
Today is Friday, April 10th. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. On Tuesday, President Trump threatened Iran, saying that a whole civilization could die, and set an 8 p.m. deadline for the regime to accept a ceasefire. Now, just before the deadline was set to expire, the U.S. received what officials described as a workable basis for negotiation from Iran. Pakistan then announced it had brokered a 2-week truce that would see an end to strikes and the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, all told, the fighting lasted 5 weeks, and one has to wonder what was actually accomplished. If the truce holds, Iran will walk away with its highly enriched uranium and retain the ability to keep firing at countries across the Middle East. More than that, the regime is now demanding a tax on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which could serve as a revenue stream to enable it to rebuild. And then there's the question of where Israel stands. It has continued to strike Hezbollah in Lebanon, but Iran is insisting that stop for the ceasefire to hold. There is a lot that is unclear and a lot that's uncertain, and so I'm pleased to welcome to the show Eli Lake. Eli is a staff columnist at the Free Press, a contributing editor at Commentary Magazine, and host of an excellent podcast called Breaking History. Eli previously wrote for Bloomberg, The Daily Beast, and Newsweek, and there is, of course, a lot to discuss. Let's get into it. Eli Lake, welcome to Boundless Insights.
Oh, Aviva, it is such a pleasure and an honor to be here. I listen to, I think, almost every episode, and I love the podcast. It's really great, and I love that you have gone short when so many of us have gone long in the podcast era.
That means a lot to me because I love your show. And I will say, actually, the number one compliment I get, which I constantly wonder if it is a compliment, is thanks for having a short show.
No. I mean, I think it fills an important gap, is what I would say.
All right. Well, as we say around here, let us get into it. There is a lot that has happened this week and a lot to discuss. The big thing for me, though, is Iran is still launching drones at countries across the Gulf. It's very unclear if the Strait of Hormuz is open. It appears 1, 2, maybe 3 ships have gone through. Lebanon may or may not be included in this ceasefire. Iran has a list of demands. Trump has a list of demands. They're definitely in parallel play. So let me start by asking you, big picture. Do you believe the war is over, and who won?
I'm not sure that the war is over. I do think that the United States and Israel are winning. And I think that if the ceasefire is implemented as was advertised, that you'd get this 2 weeks, and then hopefully that extends to another 2 weeks and on and on and on, and then you basically now have a status quo where Strait of Hormuz is open, even if there is some sort of interim toll that is collected, which is unclear, by the way. Originally, this was attributed, the Iranians said they were collecting something, working with the Omanis. Then the Omanis came out and said, no, there's no such toll collecting. But the reason I think we're winning is because what is left of all of these programs? I mean, it's not to say that they don't have missiles. They do have ballistic missiles. They have some launchers, but they have far less than they did 5 weeks ago. And if you add to that the success of, that was accomplished in the 12-day war, that has not been negated in the period of time. You mentioned in your intro the highly enriched uranium, for example, Aviva. Well, yes, there's more than 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium, but buried under, the rubble of former facilities, I think, in Isfahan. It's going to be very difficult for the Iranians to get to it. I'm not saying it wouldn't be important to eventually resolve that, but even if they got to it, which is, again, I don't think they have the capability to get to it at this point, what would they do with it? They don't have their enrichment facilities. They're a long way off. I mean, this is, in the big scheme of things, this is a $500 billion, 30-year investment in a nuclear program pretty much demolished. That's an enormous accomplishment. It doesn't mean that if they chose, I suppose they could rebuild it, but it would take, I think, we're now talking several years.
Yeah, I take all that, certainly. But if we step back and we say, what was the purpose of this war? So the number one goal that was stated both by President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu was that Iran should not be allowed to have nuclear weapons. Well, it had enriched uranium before February 28th when the war started, and it still has that enriched uranium. I take your point that it's buried below ground or difficult to get to, but Iran has much more patience than the United States and much of the West. So they're just waiting out until this president is done and then hoping.
Once they get it, where are they going to enrich it?
Well, I'm saying they can wait out this presidential term.
Where are they going to get?
For a more a president who actually is only interested in America first and not interested in what's happening in the Middle East or engaging, and then be able to rebuild their program.
I want to correct you just briefly.
Go ahead.
Iran is a threat to the entire world. It's a threat to the United States. They have gallons of American blood on its hands. Defanging and neutering Iran's death machine is very much part of an America First agenda. So I don't want to give the faction of the neo-isolationists in America the
I agree with you,
satisfaction
but
of saying
I
it's
was
not an
actually
American thing.
meaning,
Yeah,
what if a Democrat becomes president? If you look at the
yeah.
Democratic lineup right now, you could see that they would be very uninterested in engaging in a war against Iran. The second thing is, once the war started and the Strait of Hormuz was closed, then many people were saying, well, the war can't end until the strait is open, which may or may not be true because President Trump came out and said, we're not dependent on Middle East oil. So actually, that seems like somebody else's problem. But here they are still controlling the Strait of Hormuz. They were able to target other countries all across the Middle East. That didn't stop. Even after the ceasefire, they were still launching drones. And so 5 weeks of fighting later, I saw U.S. CENTCOM Chief Admiral Brad Cooper come out and say Iran's navy's destroyed, its military is destroyed, it's totally degraded. But it doesn't feel like a victory. And certainly for Israelis that spent 5 weeks running in and out of the shelters, it doesn't feel like the threat is gone.
Well, I'm more optimistic about this. I really do think it's true that it's not just the military aspect of that's been demolished in the war. It's also the defense industry, so their ability to make the missiles. So that makes them more dependent on China and Russia. Russia is bogged down in a war with Ukraine, and the Chinese and Russians didn't do much to help their ally in this war. I mean, there was some targeting help that the Russians provided. There's one report that the Chinese provided precursor chemicals for liquid fuel for missiles, but good luck using that when your missile industry is destroyed. One of the reasons I'm also optimistic is because I think it was a strategic blunder on Iran's part to fire at really sensitive targets among the Gulf monarchies. So one way to look at this, Aviva, is that one of the motivations of Yahya Sinwar for October 7th, which is how I say the war begins on October 7th in many ways, was to scuttle the prospect of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords and having a diplomatic agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Well, 5 weeks of war where Israel was not just a peer-to-peer ally of the U.S. and its Air Force, but it flew over Saudi airspace. It was effectively an ally in a war with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. If anything, Sinwar's dream of driving a wedge between Israel and the Gulf kingdoms has been defeated, and it's been defeated because of Iranian behavior. So if there was at least public-facing doubts about the war beforehand in February, which we saw, those were the signals from the Saudi Foreign Ministry, although we now know that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was urging Trump to go, go, go.
To keep going, yeah.
Yeah, and to keep going, but I'm saying even before we've seen reporting along those lines, now, the mood in the Gulf, the mood among even the Qataris expelled Iranian spies and military officers, which I never thought I would see. There's more for the Qataris, of course, to do. There's a very good chance we could see the sort of banking system in Dubai taken away from the regime, which they use to launder money and evade sanctions. That's a huge blow. I think the prestige of the regime itself not only is diminished in the region, which is to say that now it's clear Iran is an enemy, whereas before you could see the Saudis trying to sort of say exploring a rapprochement under Biden, but also what does the regime look like to its own people? There was an uprising, a horrible massacre in January to quiet the riots, to quiet the demonstrations. What I'm very excited about, which I don't think has gotten enough attention, Israel has unveiled a capability I did not know it had, which was it can now fly armed drones inside of Iran and use them to precisely target Basiji militia officers who are manning checkpoints, even when they run under a bridge. We've seen those videos. That to me seems like it's at least proof of concept for the idea that you could see close air support for demonstrations after the bombing stops. Add to that the economic calamity facing Iran right now. They are going to have a hard time paying their grunts. And then they've brought in Iraqi, Afghan kind of goons in anticipation, I imagine, of trying to suppress future demonstrations. good luck with that. They've got a lot, they're going to start paying a lot of salaries. That's going to be very difficult for them to do.
Your point about the shifting alliances in the Middle East, I think, is one of the most important points to be made. People always ask me if I'm optimistic and pessimistic about where things are going. And the truth is, when I look at it from the perspective of the United States and the West, I'm incredibly pessimistic about what is to come, especially after this president. I constantly say to myself, there is a very good chance this is the last pro-Israel president the United States is going to have for a very long time. But then I look at what's been happening in the Middle East since October 7th and the way that the existing alliances that countries have had with Israel have held. And as you've pointed out, these new alliances, whether they're public or above the radar, we certainly have seen Israeli pilots flying over all sorts of countries. We've seen sharing of intelligence, same goals. And I think that really is going to shift what the Middle East looks like in the future. But I do want to ask you about the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's leadership is obviously presenting the truce as a victory. And they are now insisting on a tax of a reported $2 million for any ship that passes through. And that would essentially offset the impact of any sanctions and actually allow it to rebuild its military capabilities. In that sense, did Iran come out ahead in this war?
No, Iran did not come out ahead. They may get some of the toll money, even in this interim ceasefire. That's not great, but it's compared to the literally hundreds of billions of dollars of losses that they've had. If you think about just the strikes in the last couple days, like 3 days ago, the Israelis hit some of the petrochemical sites. That's worth, according to some estimates that I read, that's taking like 15, 20 billion like off the table, in terms of future revenues. There just is a ton of rebuilding that they have to do. Add to that they were already in a fiscal crisis. The value of the rial was negated at the end of 2025. That was the ostensible reason why the merchant class, the Bazaris, started the latest uprising. And that's significant because historically, the Bazari class has been reluctant to join national uprisings. They've been usually the last to sort of join in when it was like Women, Life, Freedom, or the 2009 stolen election. Their currency is worth very little. They will become a kind of basket case and really dependent on China, and China will take advantage of it, as they always do. So they will be purchasing Iranian oil if they can get it at a steep discount, and they will probably subject Iran to the same kind of debt traps that they do with other third world countries. They have a short-term economic fiscal emergency. And then finally, I would just say the Saudis have a pipeline that can bypass the Strait of Hormuz. There's work right now to expand that pipeline's capacity. That is not going to take years. That's going to take months. And there are other ways to avoid the Strait of Hormuz for as long as the Iranians are in charge.
But even after enduring everything that they've endured, they're making a gamble now. They're saying we can probably extend our layer of protection to Hezbollah. I think they're banking that President Trump is done with the war. He's done with the bad press. He's concerned about the midterms. He's concerned about the economy and oil and gas prices. President Trump wants a ceasefire more than we want it, which means that we can demand that Lebanon and Hezbollah be included in this. And I don't think they're wrong. I think President Trump does want it more than the Iranians.
I don't know that President Trump will accept a bad deal. He hasn't so far. The Iranians have been very successful in negotiations when they're across the table from Obama. This is Trump, and I'm not entirely sure that that's going to be a success for them. So that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is that what he said this morning was the military is remaining in place for now and locked and loaded, as he said, or in his very Trumpian language. More pain can come if the Iranians want to kind of tap things along.
You called it the Trumpian style. So I want to ask you about Trump's approach to communication or diplomacy. On Easter Sunday, the president posted on Truth Social a post. I'm going to quote it. It says, "Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the fucking strait, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise be to Allah." On Tuesday morning, while the war was still ongoing, he posted, "A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back." And I always think that watching the war, it was almost like watching golf, where people were so concerned about what only the United States was doing, as if it was a game between the United States and itself. And they didn't seem too concerned about what Iran was saying, certainly not what Iran was doing. People are hyper fixated on President Trump's aggressive, saucy language, his use of rhetoric, and what they say was him trolling Muslims by saying praise be to Allah or Allahu Akbar. So, talk to me about your thoughts on this Trumpian approach.
Well, I was critical of it. I wrote a very tough column saying, Mr. President, don't bomb power plants or don't bomb civilian infrastructure. I think that would have been a strategic blunder of enormous proportions. The reason I think that is because I really believe that the Iranian people are ready to take their country back at some point. Again, not right away, but I would say watch that space for the next 6 months to a year, because I do think that you will see another uprising, just like we saw after the 12-Day War, and just like we've seen every few years, really, since the mid-20 teens, because it is pretty much of a failed state at this point, Iran. And Iran does have a rich, rich cultural history. And my view, in a broad scheme of Iranian history, is that the Islamic Republic is an anomaly and an outlier, and that Khomeini stole the revolution in 1979, and that a more natural sort of way to organize Iranian society in general would be to have a far more secular government. As for the Trumpian language, though, as a journalist in Washington, I don't particularly like that. But on the other hand, I think you could argue the gambit worked. Now, maybe the gambit didn't scare the Iranians, but you can't say that Trump doesn't always back up his threats, because he does go to war. He does sometimes back up his threats, particularly in the case of Iran. Now, maybe the Iran's leaders didn't think that, but I bet China did, because we know that China put a lot of pressure on the Iranians and told them that they had to accept a ceasefire. That was not their position before. Their position before was, we will discuss a permanent end to hostilities, not a ceasefire. And so now they've had to back off that. So maybe you could argue that that kind of volatility and those vituperations had a positive effect. At least it did on Iran's most important patron. I mean, on the other hand, there's a part of me as an American that would like to see the president model better behavior. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Is it a permission structure for other countries to threaten, horrific destruction? My distaste for the language and my desire for the American president to maybe set an example is horribly out of date. And I would like to go back to a world where world leaders didn't talk like that and didn't make those kinds of threats. I'm more worried about the threat than I am the profanity, to be honest.
That's right. You didn't write a column saying, don't cuss, Mr. President.
There's a huge difference between bluffing, which is what he ended up doing.
Well, I always say you have to distinguish between what he says, which you should take with a grain of salt, and what he actually does. And the actions, especially in hindsight, are always providing much more clarity than all the rhetoric and the threats.
Right. Correct.
Just before we wrap up, I want to ask you about one last thing, which is the incredible U.S. operation to recover the missing American airman who was shot down deep inside Iranian territory. That was a very scary 36 hours, and I was watching the news constantly to find out what would happen, who would get to him first. And to my mind, that was the story of the week. That was daring. It was an incredibly impressive operation. The airman showed unbelievable heroism and get himself to an extraction point. And yet it did not seem to get nearly enough attention, and certainly not praise, in the United States. What does that say about the way that the war has been playing out in the public conversation?
Well, the war is very unpopular in the United States. You have the Democrats.
Not amongst Republicans.
Well, yeah, not amongst Republicans, but Republican on the populist right influencers are against it. And then you have the Democrats who are would be against anything Trump really does. And then a lot of independents are not for it. So the numbers are not good on the war in the beginning, and usually that's not the case in the United States. On the other hand, I mean, and in fairness, Trump didn't do anything to really try to sell the war beforehand. He gave a belated speech to the nation where he explained the rationale, but it was still very kind of much of a weave, in my opinion. It wasn't a great speech. And he didn't go to Congress. And usually for a war of this magnitude, you would go to Congress. And I think he should have gone to Congress. I do think that there's murkiness in the Constitution on the sort of powers of the executive versus Congress on war making. And we have something called the War Powers Act. And, you can sort of see how maybe it falls under the War Powers Act. But leaving all that aside, he didn't really prepare the country that we were going to be doing this. So that's part of the reason why the war is not very popular. And when the war is not popular, people are going to be focused on. But I also think that the naysayers, a lot of the arguments, especially from the expert class, have been ridiculous. I've heard, in just my reporting on the U.S. side, that there is some optimism that the Iranians are finally ready to make a serious commitment on nukes, not the JCPOA under Obama, but something that would be more serious. But again, my view is that the strategic win here will be a color revolution. I think that the regime is weakened enough at this point that if you give it a little bit of a period of time for Iran's opposition to kind of get its mojo back, and also for the Iranian diaspora to become more organized, I do think that there's a lot of opportunity to finally be rid of this regime. And that's what I think is the strategic goal. You will not rid the regime by bombing. And I don't think you're going to rid the regime through a military campaign, because we don't want to be occupying Iran. And that's just off the table. That's a political impossibility at this point. But do I think there can be what we call a color revolution through nonviolent resistance? Absolutely.
So much to think about, so much to unpack, and thankfully a little bit optimistic. Thank you, Eli.
Oh, thank you, Aviva. Have me on again, please. Thank you.
Of course. That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we're so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you shake your head, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 ways to support the show. First, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors to keep the show going. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.